Hi everyone, and welcome to this Multilingual Matters online event, Ask the Authors Live. I'm Flo from Multilingual Matters, and I'm joined by my colleague Laura, who's the one in the headphones up there. She'll be dealing with the technical side of Zoom for us today. And we're also really grateful to have ASL interpreters Dresden Lamar and soon I think Neil Cordova with us, who will be helping us to make this event accessible today. The idea of the event is to highlight a few of the most recent and soon to be published books in our Bilingual Education and Bilingualism series. And we're delighted to be joined by the book series editors, Nancy Hornberger and Wayne Wright. Nancy is Professor Emerita of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, and Wayne is Professor and Barbara I. Cook Chair of Literacy and Language at Purdue University, and as well as three authors with books in their series. I have Nelson Flores from the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, and he is co-editor with Amelia Seng and Nicholas Subterello of Bilingualism for All. María Cioè-Peña from Montclair State University and her book Mothering Labeled Children. And Brian David Seilstad from the American Academy of Casablanca in Morocco, and his book Educating Adolescent Newcomers in the Super Diverse Midwest. So we'll be beginning the event with a discussion between the series editors and the authors of each book, and then there will be time at the end for some audience questions, so please do use Zoom's Q&A tool to put some questions to us if you have any during the event, and my colleague Laura will be keeping an eye on submissions, and we'll pick some to be answered by the panelists. And now I'll hand over to Nancy and Wayne, who have some questions for Nelson to start us off.
Right, thank you, Flo, for that wonderful introduction, and hello to everyone this afternoon. We're really happy to be here with these three authors, and representing actually five and more authors because of the contributors to Nelson's book. And we look forward to talking with each of you and all of you together. We'd like to start off by asking you, Nelson, it's sort of a two-barreled question. How did you come to be interested in your topic, and how did your particular positionality contribute to the topic, the book, your research in general?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this book. And as a US-born Latino, I've always been interested in issues of bilingualism because I grew up in a bilingual home. But as a teacher, I was led to believe that dual language education was in many ways the gold standard of like, this is what should be happening in classrooms for Latino children. And when I went into those classrooms, I did find a lot of great things that were happening in those classrooms. But I also found a lot of troubling things in those classrooms, in particular in relation to the power dynamics that oftentimes existed in those classrooms between the children who were oftentimes low-income immigrant children and their families, and the more affluent children and their families in those classrooms. And at the time, didn't really have a lot of resources at my disposal to make sense of what was happening in those classrooms. It was only when I came across Guadalupe Valdez's 1996, I think, article, The Cautionary Note, that I began to see, oh, there are people who are already asking these critical questions about these programs. And there are people who, from kind of the beginnings of the kind of emergence of the rise of these programs in the 1990s, were already asking these questions about the role of dual language education and simultaneously challenging issues of power by challenging kind of monolingual ideologies in classrooms, while in many ways simultaneously reproducing racial inequities between groups of people. And so we were fortunate to have Guadalupe be one of the people who wrote the afterwords for the book, which I think was a nice bookend. Because I think she's been the inspiration for many of us who contributed to the volume.
Fantastic. So, and I just want to add the edited collection. It's an amazing group of scholars that you were able to pull together for this volume. It's really terrific. What would you say was one of the most memorable experiences you had in carrying out the work for the book? Yes.
Yeah, I think what was most memorable for me particularly was, I mean, I developed the ratio-linguistic perspective with my friend and colleague, Jonathan Rosa, who's at Stanford. And though I've always been interested in issues of bilingual education, that wasn't the original framing of our framework. It was more general than that. And so I think what I found particularly exciting for myself in this volume was being able to converse with others like me who are much more specifically situated within bilingual education, who also found utility to the framework. And not just kind of applying the framework, but also extending it in new and exciting ways. I mean, Maria here is one of the contributors to the book, and I think that something that she did was really bring disability into the conversation, right? I won't say more about that because I know she'll be speaking to that, but I think each of the authors brought their own unique spin to the perspective, which showed that it can go in a range of different directions, and I'm excited to see the range of different directions that people are taking it in.
Thank you.
Sort of following up on that, the book has, as you said, so many different authors and so many sort of wonderful points of view and perspectives. But at the same time, it does have a real thread that you also mentioned, holding it all together. And so if we ask you to give your elevator speech on, what are the main points you hope readers would take away from your book, what comes to mind?
I think that for me, the overall message of the book is that if we want dual language education in the United States to have the socially transformative potential that those of us who advocate for it oftentimes say that it has, that we have to bring conversations about race and racialization and racial equity more explicitly into those conversations. Because I think what each of the chapters shows in their own ways is that the racialized experiences of the participants in the programs, whether they're students in the programs, teachers in the programs, parents and communities who are involved in the programs, policymakers who are working to create policies around these programs, their racial experience is fundamentally part of what's happening there. And so I think that for me, the big takeaway is that race matters. And that if we frame things just in terms of language, we're really missing an important component of these programs and the power dynamics that oftentimes emerge in these programs. But I think we're also missing the innovative ways that educators have been working to challenge those hierarchies within those classrooms, within the policies, within the community work. And so I think that for me, the book is not a pessimistic book. I think it's actually quite optimistic in the sense that it believes that dual language education can have transformative effects, but that there are certain aspects of race and racialization that we need to grapple with in order for these programs to have the transformative effects that they can have, and that many people on the ground are already grappling with these issues of power and are working to challenge those issues of power. And I hope that this book can provide some guidance for people who are already struggling with these issues on a daily basis in their classrooms and as policymakers.
And I'll just say that is one of the, maybe that is the most outstanding thing I love about your work. And I know many people love and find inspiring that you have the critical eye, but at the same time, you offer lots of hope and for transformation, which is great. Over to you, Wayne.
Thank you. And Nelson, I'll preface this question with, I've always enjoyed seeing your reaction when people ask if racial linguistics only applies to the US context. So I guess somewhat related to that, clearly this book has a focus on the US context with multilingualism, diversity, and othering and racism. So what do you hope international readers would take away from this particular book and how it could be relevant to their own context?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. And I think it was focused on the US context by design because it's a very specific initiative in the US where dual language education has kind of exploded exponentially since the 90s and has been fraught and the ways it's been implemented in ways that I think are specific to the US and specific to the racialized histories of the US. That said, if we understand race as a global phenomenon in the sense that race is connected to colonialism, race as a concept that was produced as part of the justification for colonialism, then we can certainly begin to think about, okay, so what would the implications of a racial linguistic perspective have for contexts where those racial histories may be a little different than the US? And I actually would love to do a follow-up at some point that does some type of kind of global view on these issues, because I come from the perspective that race is not just a US issue, and that race and racialization are kind of global issues. White supremacy is a global issue, but that it oftentimes manifests differently in different contexts because of the specific histories of those contexts. And so I would welcome follow-up conversations about how initiatives focused on promoting language diversity in other contexts, the implications of a racial linguistic perspective for some of that work. And I think there are some people who are already doing that. There are people I know in South America who are beginning to think through kind of racial linguistic perspective and with the specific histories of colonialism in Latin America that are in some ways quite different from the histories of colonialism in the United States. And I think there are also people that I've come across doing work in kind of the African context who are beginning to think about these issues. And so I think that's all really exciting. And I think that connects back to the point that I was trying to make. What I found most exciting about this particular volume is seeing people taking ideas that I and Jonathan kind of developed on our own, based on our own experiences, and really extending it in really exciting and innovative ways.
Fantastic, thank you. It sounds, Flo, we've got the next idea for a book here. So
yeah, exactly. We're pinning you down, Nelson. No, we can't do that, but we hope to. María, this is this perfect sequel, right? You just already got introduced by Nelson a little bit. And we'd like to start off by asking you also how you came to be interested in your topic and how your own positionality contributed to the book, your research.
Great, thanks. I want to start off by saying first, thank you so much for having me and for including me not only in this event, but in this series. Your work, Wayne, and your work, Nancy, Nelson's work certainly have definitely influenced my own scholarship and just my teaching practice. So I'm just really grateful for that. So I came to be interested in the topic because I was very fortunate in my graduate program. So I was a teacher before I was a PhD, or before I was in academia. I was a classroom teacher, and in my graduate program was very driven around inquiry-based classroom practices, and particularly the work of descriptive inquiry and descriptive review. So for me, I was constantly asking questions in my classroom and discussing them, and mostly trying to figure out how to support my students better, of like a community of peers. And in 2010, my classroom was shut down. So I was teaching in a bilingual special education setting, and that classroom was shut down in response to special education reform in New York City. And this was believed, special education reform was believed to be a win, right? Especially for people with disabilities and students with disabilities, because it was moving towards more inclusion and fewer segregated classroom placements, right? So we had kids who were in segregated schools, who were busing across cities and towns, across the city and across different neighborhoods in order to be able to get to a specialized school rather than their community school. But when that decision was made, you know, those students moved from bilingual special education settings to monolingual special education settings, right, which were inclusive. So they had them alongside their typically developing peers, but there was something that was then missing, right, culturally and linguistically. And for me, there was a little bit of a tension because I felt also that I hadn't been prepared on how to be a bilingual special education teacher. I had been prepared on how to be a special education teacher with a bilingual extension, right? And so it became that my practice was teaching special education in translation, right? And we know that that's not exactly how the practice should be, right? It's a lot more complex. The ways that disability and language learning intersect is bountiful, right? There's a lot of places where there's need, but there's also a lot of places where there's opportunities for strength. So I started actually by interviewing teachers and asking them about how they felt about the special education reform and the shift. And one of the teachers who was a colleague of mine previously said something that really sparked a seed or planted a seed in my mind, which was, you know, the people I feel bad for are the parents because they didn't have a say in this, right? The classrooms changed, and then now they have to deal with me. I'm a monolingual English speaker and they don't speak English, and what are we doing? And so that really got me interested in looking at, we talk often about how the home influences school, right? Either academic achievement or opportunity gaps, but we don't talk about the ways in which policies that are made in schools that address disability and supersede language, how they also create tensions in the family. So I wanted to see not what was happening at school, but how were the decisions that are happening at school playing out in family dynamics? How does it look at home, right? And that's really where it kind of came to. And I ended up doing the work that's in this book based out of my own neighborhood. So I was working with parents who were attending the school that I had taught at, the school that my sister had attended, you know, so it was a space that I knew. And it also happened around the time after the Trump election. So it also allowed a space for conversations that were kind of in the shadows, right? There were conversations that people were nervous about. What does this mean for bilingualism moving forward? What does this mean for my child in terms of disability? And this was a space in which we could talk about those things.
Fascinating. Over to you, Wayne. Thank you, Maria. That was great.
Thank you, Maria. Maybe just continuing along that line. I mean, this is really an amazing study you did, and was really happy to see the focus on mothering, you know, in these situations. What would you say was the most memorable experience you had carrying out the work for this book?
I would say just how, particularly with my 3 case study mothers, who I call the testimonialistas, I would say the bond that we formed is something that was really surprising for me. I was pregnant with my 2nd child at the time, so that became a point of conversation for us. At the time, I hadn't told anybody the gender, but because I knew that my participants were going to be sharing, you know, really private stuff, I shared it with them. Right, so I would share with them what the gender was, and notice, and you know, afterwards they were sending me gifts for my baby, like just this sense of this wasn't just an interview in and out, right? These were conversations, these were connections that were made, and I think that that really shows through in the book, or at least I hope that it's an attempt to present these women as holistic. So they talked to me about their joys, but they also talked with me about their struggles. They talked about the moments where they feel weak and powerless, but they also talked about where they feel strong. And I think that that for me was really powerful. I was not expecting so much honesty and trust to be invested in me so quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds, I sort of, when I read your work and now when I hear you talk, I sort of wish I had been one of the mothers. You must have a wonderful way with people in general, and a chance for them to talk and you to talk and to give their testimonies. Really beautiful. So we've heard a little bit about the context and what the book is about. What do you hope readers might take away from your book as the main points?
I guess that for me, the main point is that we really need to reshift or reframe the way we look at parents, particularly the way we look at marginalized and minoritized families. You know, often in American culture, or the way that American culture talks about parental engagement, it's all about very specific kinds of ways of showing up at school. And that then becomes internalized within these mothers. So even though these mothers are doing amazing things, buying books for their kids, you know, shuffling them 3 hours here on the train, 3 hours there to make sure that they got to the tutor, or they were hiring a tutor to come to the house, they themselves viewed themselves as inactive in their child's education because it wasn't happening at school. So my hope is that we find ways to open lines of communication with mothers, because I do believe they have a lot of things to say. They just don't feel like what they have to say is of interest, right? Or they don't feel like what they have to say is polished enough, or, you know, And I think that that really ties back to Nelson's work around ratiolinguistics, right? It's the ways in which we perceive communication styles, and the ways in which we perceive people's behaviors, and how those are colored, right, for lack of a better word, by our own biases, right? And how that plays out at schools as well. So for me, it's about finding ways to create better communications and relationships between schools and home that isn't just one-sided.
Great. Thank you so much. And Maria, I just comment that, Nancy and I were really excited when we first saw the proposal, because some of the books in our series focus on a school setting. And so to really have the focus here within, the family and particularly with mothers, we thought was a real terrific addition to the series. So, and this will, again, let you extend on that, your previous answer, but, why would teachers want to read, or why should they read a book that centers on mothers rather than other teachers in classrooms, or even to some extent students?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of literature on teachers. I think there's a lot of literature on students, and a lot of people who are doing that thought process. And I don't think that there's a lot of space in which parents are being included, much less invited, to be the primary voice. And I think that that's important and that's significant. I also think we need to also, as educators, recognize that there are things happening in the home that we can learn from, right? That there are things happening in the home that benefit our own classroom practices, right? So if I know that a student is struggling with sleep, I know that that's going to impact their learning, right? But then at the same vein, I have to recognize that if I'm only sending homework home in English to a multilingual household, that's going to result in tensions in the home, right? And we cannot, as educators, absolve ourselves of the responsibilities of how we shape and shift relationships in the home when we assign schoolwork, right? And when we kind of dictate the language in which that happens. And so, what ends up happening is we tell mothers, you have to be active and be helpful, but then the ways in which they can be helpful are not accessible to them. And so when they don't engage in those ways, we then say, well, you're not engaged and you're not present. So my hope is that this book will allow us to understand how parents make decisions. Maybe they don't come to IEP meetings, but they have other reasons, and other things that influence them. They're caretaking for other members of their family. They have their own struggles that they're dealing with. And even though they seem separate, they do really show up in the context of how they engage in their children's academic lives.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We look forward to hearing more from you in the rest, later in the session. But I'll turn to Brian now, who tells us he's in Morocco at the moment, and yet his book is all about the super diverse Midwest of the U.S. So one question that comes to mind is, how did you come to be interested in your topic, and how did your own positionality contribute to the book and to your research?
Thank you. And I want to echo what everybody has said. I have a huge amount of gratefulness to be included in this webinar and to be included in this series. I'm really here with some of the people that I've read deeply and admire so much. So I feel quite humbled and just appreciative to be included. So the book itself and the issue of being in Morocco is kind of related. So I grew up in Montana. I'm from a town of like 300 people in central Montana. I grew up in a essentially English-speaking home and community. And
I know, they all begin with M.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just I have to figure out, I try to live in, I don't know, Mauritania and other places and weave it all together. But I grew
Sorry.
No, not at all. Growing up in that background, I mean, I don't know what it is about my interests, but I eventually went to university, and then I eventually joined Peace Corps and came to Morocco in 2005. At that time, I had already become fairly multilingual as an adult. I had, learned German and French and Greek and Latin and various things as part of my academic journey. And I think it started to experience some of those feelings like, I wanted to be more, proficient in these things. I think, coming to realize more the challenges of being an adult language learner and some of the affordances we have as adults or adolescents compared to children, and so when I came to Morocco in Peace Corps, that's when I started learning Arabic, and luckily had a very good experience there. And I would say today, am quite proficient in Arabic and French and a few other languages. So after I was working in Morocco at a university called Al Akhawain between 2010 and 2014, and was getting the idea to join a PhD program, and luckily was accepted at Ohio State and came to Ohio with, I think, some ideas like maybe the Midwest wasn't going to be that exciting or that multilingual or that whatever. And I was thinking, well, maybe I'll end up doing a Fulbright and coming back to Morocco or something. But as soon as I got to Ohio, I just started to notice that, wow, this is really a very diverse community. It's changed a lot. And immediately I started to know people that were, multilingual and coming from all sorts of areas. And I got involved with a refugee support agency that kind of guided me towards the work with the Adolescent Newcomer Program that is at the heart of this book. And I just knew, I think, working there, my advisor was Leslie Moore, who's also very involved in multilingualism in different communities. And so I think I was very attuned to trying to work in a context where language learning and equity and schooling was going to be central to what was going on. And kind of by chance in Columbus there, or in Ohio, there is a adolescent newcomer program, which adolescent newcomer programs are a particular thing that happens in some school districts when there is what I call super diverse, or what happens with super diverse conditions, the theory or whatever of super diversity. When this kind of shifts in diversity happen in a rapid time scale, sometimes, frankly, school districts kind of freak out and they don't know what to do with a lot of these different communities that are showing up. And of course, we're talking about communities that are used to being white or English medium only or predominantly English communities. And then when in Central Ohio, you had people coming from Somalia and then Nepal and various other groups showing up, and the school district didn't quite know what to do. And in the early 2000s, created a adolescent newcomer program to try to help students acquire English, basically. And so when I interacted with this program, it would already been around for almost 20 years at this point, but by itself is a really interesting program. You have all these kids who are middle and high school age who have come to Central Ohio, and for better or for worse, some people criticize these programs as being segregation, which I do agree with has a serious issue, but they also have a certain positive possibility there where students can go into a kind of a sheltered program, work to improve their English and their home language if the district is ready for that. And the program was not really doing a lot of home language work, but nevertheless, they're doing their best to try to support these adolescent language learners, English language learners, and trying to, basically try to get them into the mainstream and try to achieve lives of dignity. So I was interested in that just because of my own, I think, multilingualism and my challenges or experiences as an adult language learner. I've always enjoyed working with adolescents. I mean, I started my career teaching in a high school in Baltimore and spent my Peace Corps years working with adolescents. So I've always enjoyed that. And I think my positionality as a white male is that I've enjoyed being in school a lot. And I'm also deeply aware that a lot of other people have not enjoyed being in school and have had really hard experiences there. And I just feel that it's important for all of us educators to work hard to change that and make sure that schooling becomes a rich and a positive and a loving and uplifting experience for everybody. I love Ophelia Garcia has that fairly recent article about trying to create lives of dignity, drawing on both sides of the line so that we're really doing something positive for students. And so I think that was in the behind all that is just a idea to be committed to language, committed to people, trying to make the most of a thing, and then really working and seeing what a school system is doing to try to support learners that come very frequently under quite challenging circumstances, but also with a lot of promise.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I have to tell you, Brian, I was excited when I saw this title of the book, being someone who's also in the Midwest, next door in Indiana. And I kind of had my same perceptions when I moved here from San Antonio, Texas. But you don't normally see the word super diverse and Midwest, in the same sentence. So really appreciate you bringing attention to the diversity that is here in this area. And also note too that this is a really rich, thick ethnographic account, with really great storytelling. And you also kind of, veer from, having spent time in this, as a volunteer and employee, to then putting on the researcher hat and taking the more critical look. So if you can just talk in general about what that was like and what, the most memorable experiences you had carrying out this work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was reflecting on this. I think there's two things that stand out for me, and one is to start with the students. I mean, of course, in the specific class that I followed, there were students that spoke a variety of Spanish, Portuguese, Nepali, Somali, Mai, Kibembe, Swahili, Arabic, and I may be forgetting some other language groups, named languages, of course, So just seeing how those students, when they got into the room together, the class started at the beginning of the year in August with like 13 students, and then throughout the course of the year, 50 students had kind of flowed in and out of the class in different ways. There was only a kind of one core group of maybe 8 students that was there from the beginning to the very end. So it was really just wonderful in a way, also challenging, but mainly wonderful to see how these students came together in a room and moved across their coursework and supported each other as best as they can. Of course, the students that have had similar language affinities work together very well. I would say looking at like the Nepali students, they had a instant kind of group that they work with, the Spanish speaking groups and so on. But it was also just wonderful to see the students as they worked across many challenging linguistic barriers to make meaning together, complete homework, support each other, get on the bus together, and so on. It wasn't always pretty. I mean, there were fights and there were things that broke out that was not always easy for the students. And some students, several of the students that I feature or focus on the book ended up dropping out of the program for the frustration. Probably my main sort of focal student is a student I call Salah, who was a Jordanian student who, because he maybe didn't have a strong prior schooling experience and issues with home language literacy, and then challenges with the overall environment, he ends up dropping out by January, which was kind of for me a very sad event, because especially since at my Arabic proficiency, I was working a lot with him to try to help his experience be as positive as it could be, and it didn't quite work out that way. So I mean, again, so I'd say that the first one is just the students and working with them, and then the second thing, the most memorable, I think, is getting the deep perspectives, especially from the administrators. I had the good fortune to have, I think, pretty strong access and connections within the school, and so I have a lot of really, I think, pretty interesting interviews, especially with the director of the program there, who, in my opinion, is kind of putting his finger on the challenge. He's aware that the program is not there yet. He's aware that they need to put more emphasis on home language support and home language development and decenter English. But he's also aware that he faces sometimes many challenges, such as tenured teachers who are not bilingual or multilingual, who don't want to make a transfer to a different school to allow a bilingual assistant or something to be promoted. And he says directly, I mean, some of the, I think, kind of gasp-worthy quotes in the book are where he says, I bet I could not convince one of these teachers to move out of this school for an extra $2,500 a year. And it puts its finger on, yes, many of the teachers there who are, monolingual and they've developed a certain proficiency and so on, they're lovely people. There's nothing wrong with them, but they might not be the best fit for that environment, and there might be better spaces for some of the bilingual people to come in. So those kind of tensions, I think, are at play, and I really appreciated people's honesty to put their finger on those things, and especially when they knew they're kind of on the record.
Thank you. You did a great job of getting that honesty out of people. So
Thank you.
that speaks volumes to your ability to build those relationships of trust there. So wonderful job. Nancy, over to you.
And given all the richness and complexity that you've started to give us, in your account here, when you step back a little bit and want to convey what's your main point, what do you hope readers would take away from your book as main points?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the first one is about decentering English. It's, of course, in the United States, English and learning English is part of what can be important to having a life of dignity. It's not the only thing. It's not a necessary thing, but it's something that could be helpful, and especially in school that can be important. So, and I think this is sort of drawing what on Nelson or many others have said. That has never been a question in schools in dual language or other kinds of programming. It's really how we get there. And again, I really appreciate like Ophelia Garcia's most recent, that article about both sides of the line, and how are we going to actually draw on home language knowledge, like what Maria is talking about, what's going on in the home of multilingual families, multicultural families, to inform what's happening in school, and making sure that that is the center, that people are having their home language and their home culture at the center of their schooling experience. And unfortunately, many people go into school and just don't see anything of that in their schooling experience, which is a very frustrating thing. And I think the connected to that, there's sort of two sides. That I think there's a radical side of this. We do need a revolution. I mean, like Nelson has talked about having a revolution in educational linguistics, and I totally agree that we need to have that. But at the same time, some of the things are practical. In my book, I talk about how, just if the school had enacted a super simple home language literacy test, just to know if the students, if the kid, knew how to read and write in their home language. And then if that student didn't know how to read and write in their home language, ensure that at least that student gets at least a period a day of time on their home language. I was suggesting in the book, it would have been wonderful for homeroom, the first period of the day, to be a home language experience where, you come to class, you come to school, you go straight to a class that is at least based on your home language. The school announcements and so on can be delivered in your home language. You can understand what's going on. You can, start to develop proficiency. And then if you go outside of that class and go to whatever science, and it's more English and so on, but just, the very, like, a basic practical thing to ensure that at least at a minimum, people's home language is centered at some point of their school day, I think could do a lot. And of course, we can be much more radical and go beyond that. But the reality is a lot of students never see their home language as part of their schooling experience. And it's really frustrating for them. And, the behaviors that can sometimes emerge from that, whether it's, putting your head down and crying because you're so frustrated. One of the young women I profile, she just puts her head down in class one day and cries. And I asked her later, like, why was that? And she's just like, I love Portuguese. I miss my country. I don't get a chance to do this ever. And this was a girl that would be reading in, like Nicholas Sparks novels in Portuguese in the middle of class, who clearly was like very literate and really connected to things, but just never had a chance to have that be valued throughout her day. So all of the frustrations that can arise in school, from fighting to being depressed to feeling down, can I think be at least in part by A, radically decentering English, and B, practically doing things to make the home language experience, home language part of the schooling experience.
That's great. And I'm thinking, thank you for like summarizing those two main points. Maybe we should move on to the group discussion. I'm sorry, we're sort of skipping one of Brian's questions, but maybe it'll come out in the discussion. Is that right? Am I right about the time?
We've got quite a few questions from the audience now, so I think it would be a good idea to start getting through some of those. I've got this first one from Abbas Al-Shamari, who asks all the panelists, how could we as EFL teachers apply teaching approaches to a context where English is taught as a foreign language with a special focus on culture pertaining to race? And perhaps Nelson, could you kick us off with your answer to that? Or someone else, if someone else.
Yeah, I think for me, the important place to begin that question is to think about how we are thinking about language. I think that at least in the US context, and I'm sure this is probably true in other parts of the world as well, oftentimes language in the classroom is understood to be a set of rules that people have to learn. And as kind of, so a set of rules that people have to learn, right? Which isn't actually what language is. Language is a social practice that people engage in on a daily basis, and are socialized into new ways of using language as part of their interaction with other people. And so something that I oftentimes say is that language to me is something that's really exciting and interesting and creative, but oftentimes in classrooms is treated as something dead and boring and rigid. And so I think that if we switch away from thinking about language in the ways that it's traditionally been defined in schools in this kind of curricularized form, and adopt a kind of more exploration model of language, that's going to allow classrooms to have very different types of conversations about language. And so you wouldn't be talking about what's correct or incorrect, what's right or wrong. You would instead be looking at kind of the ways that people use language and try to understand why it is that they're using language in these ways. And I think that that would allow for more fun conversations in class around language. But I'm sure others have more specifics on that. But I do think that the orientation we take to language is the important foundation for work in classrooms that's working to dismantle kind of racial ideologies.
Thanks, Nelson. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that.
I think the only thing that I would add is that we have to recognize that within language education, as we're discussing it, there's a lot of power dynamics that are at play. And oftentimes we treat students as if they are the receivers of language rather than they already possess language, right? They have understandings, they've noticed things. Nelson has previously talked in his work about, I'm gonna get the phrase wrong, but about turning children into, linguistic anthropologists, right? Or linguistic archaeologists, I don't know, something like that. But this idea that like they make them be interested, right? Ask them to inquire about what things they notice or don't notice. I'm somebody who English is my second language. I've learned other languages, and it's those investigations, those queries, right? Of looking for those things, of those patterns, and that fun part of thinking of language not as static that really has kind of flourished a love of language for me.
Thanks, Maria. Then Brian, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Maybe just saying, like, sort of related to the issue of what language is rejecting ideas of like the canon and so on. I mean, especially when you're teaching things where there's a set, like, okay, we need to read Shakespeare or whatever, like there's no need to worry about any canon or whatever. Teach things that are interesting to the students, that are born from whatever culture or linguistic background that they are interested in. So, I'm teaching in Morocco now, and, many times it's like, let's find a book that was written by somebody here or some podcast, like anything. And then even if it's not in English, just, using it, an Arabic language podcast to incite a conversation about anything in the classroom just makes it feel so much more relevant.
Just adding to that, can I just say, so I think in a lot of EFL contexts in particular, many students who are learning English to interact with other people who also are second language learners of English. And yet so much of the curriculum is focused on them interacting with monolingual speakers of English. And so there's a disconnect between their actual uses of language and what the curriculum expects them to do, right? And so I think bringing in more authentic text into the classroom from people who are positioned as non-native or positioned as second language learners, if that's going to be the population that the learners are going to be interacting with, then we should be bringing that more into the classroom for them, right?
Yeah, really good point. Thank you. Thanks, Nelson. Okay, we have another question for Maria from Deb Palmer, who is also an author in this series, who asks if you would be able to elaborate a little on the chapter which you've written in Nelson's book.
Yes, and it will allow me to say something that I forgot to say before about my book. So in the chapter, I discuss the ways essentially in which dual language programs growth correlates with perceived value of either language or of the student. And I do this by showcasing an example in a community in the Lower East Side in New York City, in which the school housed a Mandarin dual language program, but the population at the school was predominantly users of Fujianese and Spanish. And so whenever you asked, it was like, well, you know, the most vocal parents are the white parents, and they are interested in Mandarin, right? And so then you have students who are Fujianese speakers being placed in Mandarin classrooms so that it looks like there's a real dual immersion program, but really these students are now learning two languages, right? In addition to their own home language practice. So what does that create? And so what it shows is the ways in which we think about program formation more in terms of like meeting a demand rather than necessarily cultivating something in children. And so children in this school were either included in the dual language program, either based on their background, right? So if they were Mandarin adjacent, or if they were typically developing students. And I think that that's an important thing to think about, because when my experience of conversations of disability within bilingual education have overwhelmingly been deficit centered. We talk about keeping our students out of special education, right? But our students are in special education, right? All students are our students. So we need to not only be concerned with the inappropriate referrals, right? But also be concerned with what happens once they are diagnosed and placed in a program, right? So for most of these children, including the children featured in my book, their home language practices are multilingual, right? But they're being told by their schools, right? Or they're being told by evaluators that they're going to get confused in a multilingual environment, right? And so when we talk about inclusion within special education or disability, we're thinking about including children based on their abilities and ranges. But I also think we need to think about language as an inclusion criteria, because it doesn't make sense for a student to be in a room alongside their typically developing peers if they can't communicate with them, right? Be that in the same language or through their own communication styles, right? And so I think that my hope in that article and that chapter, and as well as in my book, is to get people to understand that disability does not automatically mean monolingualism, right? And that lived experiences are what should determine people's linguistic practices, not the commodifiable value of that practice later, right? And so that's really what it's looking at. It's like Mandarin will be more valuable, right, on the global scale than Fujianese, and Mandarin is more valuable than Spanish for brown kids, right? So how are we talking about language, but also how are we talking about children, in which we're piecing them up and then just talking about them as the sum of their parts, right? And that's also part of the book of like, they're mothering labeled children, right? But it's really that we are othering the children by creating all of these labels and not attending to the holistic child, but rather to their classifications as English language learners or students with disabilities. And so that I explore in that chapter by looking at a school dynamic. And here in the book, I explore that phenomena by looking at family dynamics.
Great. Thank you very much, Maria. We have a question for all panelists again from Shorki Bakari. I'm really sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Who says, how can we challenge low prestige of immigrant languages in the language classroom? Maybe Brian, you'd like to start us off there?
Sure. The issue of prestige, that's an interesting sort of framing. I guess I would just feel that I'm not sure about prestige. I mean, I'm thinking that the main thing is people should feel that their languages are included in their educational experiences, so that they feel connected to school and they are able to create possibilities for connections between the home and the community. And I think when that happens, I mean, this is one thing that I kind of raise about this relation between like practical and radical things. In the program I was at, the idea that you could do have the students who speak Arabic or the students who speak Kibembe, working together on their home language in first period or any of the periods throughout the day. I think that would create a sort of reciprocal dynamic between giving it prestige by giving it time, giving it human resources, teachers and so on, who are proficient to guide students in that, in the exploration of their home language and the development of it, however that may go. I think that would in itself give it prestige, and then that would flow out into the rest of the school day, the rest of the school district, and out into the community, where, you know, there's the recognition that we care enough about these languages, the home languages of our students, to give them basically our time and our money and our interest from a public setting. I mean, that's a very important point. You know, the public school system is here to serve everybody, and I think that just by devoting that energy and thinking and time and just, I know, you know, we all work in school system, we know what it would take, the mental energy it would take to organize these kind of classes around that. And it would be a significant amount of collaboration, effort, discussion around curriculum and so on. I think all of that energy would dramatically raise the prestige of any language that was considered less prestigious somehow. And people would start to see it as being valuable. And it would be interesting just to see how it would flower out into other domains.
Thanks, Brian. Maria or Nelson, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I guess I would just add that it's important for us to be conscious about how we perceive those languages ourselves, and how that comes through in our own teaching practice. You know, I think one tension that I encounter a lot when I talk to educators about this is, well, what if I don't speak the language? And so there's this perception of perfection that needs to be attained in order to be a teacher, right? And I feel like what we really need is a community of inquiry, right? So let's all investigate and learn together. Let's talk about things together. And paying attention to your choices as an educator is important, right? So what books are you featuring and how are you introducing them? Are you making like a big fanfare about some things and not other things? You know, what colors are you featuring languages in your classroom, right? So like think about the multilingual ecology that you're creating and how that is also contributing to students' perceptions. And I'm just thinking back to Nelson's contribution earlier around language architects, right? That like, we're not engaging in authentic experiences, and that's why things don't feel valuable, right? So if we create situations in which students feel like their languages are not valued, then that's an accurate feeling, right? And it's based on if we're constructing these really fake experiences rather than allowing them to grow and explore their interests linguistically.
And I think just adding to that, what I would say is that I think getting back to the point that I was also making before, I think is really pushing beyond dichotomous views of language, which don't actually map onto how people actually use language. And so like the one that's kind of hegemonic in the US and maybe other parts of the world is academic versus non-academic language, as if when someone is engaged in quote academic language, there's some type of homogeneous set of linguistic features that they're using, and that anyone who's using it is doing the exact same thing. But that's of course not what anyone actually does, right? There are maybe features that are more salient in academic language or in academic context, but we don't all sound the same, even in academic context, right? Each of us brings our own unique repertoire to play in how we present ourselves in academic context. And so I think that the more we can move away from a dichotomous view of language towards one that really focuses on rhetoric and how people construct language and providing tools for students to really think about how it is that they want to position themselves in relation to these different rhetorical choices they can make, I think the more that we're working to challenge the idea of prestige in the classroom, because we're kind of rejecting the very idea that there are some forms that are inherently more prestigious than others. Instead, we're working to empower students to use the repertoire that makes sense to them and position themselves in ways that make sense to them and feel authentic to them.
Thanks, Nelson. We've got a question from Taylor, who is really appreciative of today's amazing interpreters. Thank you to them. And asks our panelists if they have any experiences of working with deaf or hard of hearing students and their language inclusion. I don't know if any of you do, if you want to chip in, if you have.
So I can share mine. So I don't particularly have work or relationships with deaf and hard of hearing. What does come through in my work and in my research is around nonverbal students, which kind of fall under a different umbrella of language use. And so with deaf and hard of hearing students, it's been difficult for me to encounter as a classroom teacher, right? There's very particular kind of trainings that are part of that. And, you know, the medium of communication is really difficult, but it's interesting to look at how mothers construct or interpret multilingualism or bilingualism in their nonverbal children. And so within nonverbal children, mothers still identify them as bilingual, as being bilingual, because it's not about output, right? It's about input. So they are understanding, they're engaging, they're interacting with their families. And I think that that's an important point to kind of think about in terms of language, that it's not just about what's produced or what's made, but that language is, the whole purpose of language is meaning making, right? And communicating and being social and interacting. So not thinking about that sound correlates with language, right? Their language is broader than that, and our definitions and our conceptualizations of it need to be broader too. But if someone has more specific things about deaf and hard of hearing.
So I don't, but someone whose work that I suggest that you look up. So John Henner is someone thinking about kind of extending my ideas in ways that I had never really anticipated. He and colleagues are beginning to think through a ratio-linguistic perspective and language architecture in the case of American Sign Language. I don't know if the chapter is out yet, but he shared a chapter with me that calls into question the dichotomy of academic and non-academic ASL, using some of the frameworks that I've developed as well. And so he's someone that I've learned a lot from in terms of thinking about deaf education. He's also really prolific on Twitter. People are on Twitter. And I suggest that people look up his work because he, one, is deaf and has that experience that I don't have, but two, has been doing a lot of really interesting work in the area.
And one interesting critique that John Henner has, which is valuable, is that ASL is not thought about as a language in the same ways as all these other dual language programs, and how that then kind of creates its exclusion from bilingual education conversations in and of themselves. Thank you, Nelson, for bringing John into it.
Thanks both. I think we have time for one more question. This one goes to Brian, and it's from Brahim. He says, can you say a little more on how your experiences as a Peace Corps volunteer shaped your trajectory, specifically how multilingualism in Morocco played a role in your multilingual identity?
Yeah, thanks. So I think for Peace Corps, for me, and a lot of Peace Corps volunteers have this experience. It's just a deep and rich experience that transforms your life. And but I also think I'm very aware too that it's problematic in some ways. Peace Corps does have an aspect of kind of white saviorism and so on. So I think those are the things I've kind of wrestled with in my own my own life. But as far as like my multilingual journey, the things that have come out is I feel like I didn't have a lot of like deep awareness. I think I came to Peace Corps and a lot of my language learning experiences with very monoglossic views about language. Like I thought I was going to be able to come to Morocco and become like completely 100% like native fluent, like forget English and just like a bunch of things that were kind of odd in retrospect. But I think it does come from some of the monoglossic views that I think I have in me, like growing up in a very like kind of monoglossic environment and then growing up and then getting out into the world more, experiencing and learning as languages as an adult, and then realizing that there are all these other factors that can go into notions of like proficiency and fluency. I consider myself a highly proficient user of Moroccan Arabic or French or whatever, but not in every register. I mean, if I was asked to run a giant business meeting in French or whatever, it'd be challenging. Or if I was asked to teach academic coursework in standard Arabic, it would be a challenge for me. But at the same time, I function very well in many of the social environments that exist. So I think that's been helpful for me just to think through this issue, like what Nelson or María was talking about. It's not dichotomous, you know, their language is so much about these different social practices, and I just personally haven't had some of the demands that other people have put on them. And I think that's one of the, you know, I have a privilege of being an English speaker, and that in a lot of contexts I can operate with that and use my multilingualism in other ways as a support. And so I think that those are things I've been wrestling with, you know, the privilege of many of the positions I have. I've been, you know, being multilingual is certainly a great experience and something I'm continuously learning and expanding. Like I work at this, you know, at a school, and every single day students are teaching me new words, mostly inappropriate words for things, and it's just great, and it just makes language and learning and as part of a lifetime journey. And I guess what that brings to my research is just an awareness that there is not in any social setting one way that things are going to go. People are going to make meaning together in so many complex ways. And in the research I did, you know, students were working so hard across their individual linguistic repertoire, the social repertoire. I mean, you have these moments where the student who spoke Somali would be trying to make meaning with the person who spoke Spanish, and the Nepali student who was sort of making, you know, inroads across those students. And then a lot of students today are reaching to like Google Translate and other forms of multimodal translation just to make meaning. And there's just that deep connection that people want to make across language to be human with each other. And
Great, thanks so much, Brian. I'm afraid that is all that we've got time for today. But thank you so much to Wayne and Nancy for getting this conversation off to a really great start, and to our panelists Maria, Nelson, and Brian. It's been really interesting, and also to our ASL interpreters Dresden and Neil. You guys have been absolutely amazing. We really appreciated you making the event accessible for everybody. Thank you very much. So we will be offering a discount code if you want to buy any of the books discussed today at a 50% discount. You can use CPFS50 on our website, www.multilingual-matters.com, and you can use that until the end of April. Thanks so much for joining us all today. We really appreciate it. We hope you've enjoyed it, and see you again at another event.